Now that I've got my clay wedged and I've got my tools set up at the wheel, I want to talk a little bit about what you need to do once you sit down at the wheel. Now, a lot of your success when throwing a pot is going to be your body position when you're at the wheel. The wheel head is always at the same height no matter what size person you are. I always tell my students, whether they're 4 foot tall or whether they're 6 foot tall, that the wheel and the chair should be just about the same height. If you have your chair too low, you're going to be having to push too high up across the wheel head. If you have your wheel or your chair set up too high to the wheel, then you're leaning down on it and you can't really get the pressure that you need in trying to get everything centered. You really want it so everything's just right at the height where when you sit down and you lean down, you've got your arms on your sides. When you lean down and your elbows hit your thigh, you are right on top of the clay. A lot of what you're doing is not about the strength of your arms pushing on the clay, it's about the weight of your body pushing on the clay. Doesn't matter how big you are, how strong you are, if you don't have the right body position and your arms are up here all flailing around, you're never going to get your clay centered in it. And that's just the way it works. So, you've got your seat set up, you've got your water on one side, you've got your tools on one side, everything's ready to go. You've got clay cut up, weighed out, and what I have is several balls of clay that are about 1.5 pounds each. And I've got them set up so I don't have to continually go back to the wedging table, wedge up a ball of clay, come back and sit down. I get everything ready so I can throw several pieces without having to really do anything else other than sit and throw them. A lot of wheels are set up so you can throw directly on the wheel head itself. You would put the clay right on the top and go. The wheels we have here in the studio have what are called bat pins. And it's a metal pin that is inside the wheel head and it holds down a removable bat. If I were to throw directly on the wheel head, these bat pins would spin around and hit me right in the hands. And it's going to make it really difficult to throw because you're going to have this thing cracking me in the knuckles over and over. So what we use, instead of right on the wheel head, it's called a bat. And bats are made out of plastic, they're made out of wood. It's any material that is solid enough that can be put down on the wheel to be removed. So if you have a pot on your wheel that you don't want to cut free, you can pick it up and set it aside and then just replace the whole bat. I've got a couple different plastic bats. Plastic bats are really nice. They're inexpensive. I personally prefer using the wooden bat. And it's just one of those things. It's not one is not better than the other. It's just a personal preference. So I'm going to go ahead and get my bat secured to the wheel, and I'm going to get started on centering some clay. The bat that I just put on, and it'll happen with plastic bats, wooden bats, it will get warped, and it'll have a high side and a low side, and it'll be shaped like a top if you have the low side, pointing up and the high side down. So when I put it on the wheel, it wants to rock around. So I have to flip it over so that high side faces upward. On my wooden bat, I have to get it a little dampened before I can get started. If I were to just put my clay right down on the bat, because it's dry, the clay won't stick to it. It has to be just wet enough to make it so the clay is going to stick. On the plastic bat, if I got it wet at all, it'll make it really slippery and the clay won't stick. It'll just slide right off. So you got to remember, depending on the bat you use, what you have to do to get the bat ready. Plastic bat has to be dry and clean. The wooden bat has to be damp and clean. So I've got everything ready to go. I'm going to pull out a ball of clay. Now, after I've wedged and I've cut my clay up, I'll put it back in a plastic bag. I don't want my clay drying out and getting stiff before I can use it. So I've cut it into slices. Now, I'm going to pat this clay into a small round ball. Since I'm trying to make something round, I want to start with a clay ball that's already round. If this was all chunky and clunky looking, when I put it on here and I go to center, it's going to make it just that much harder. So you need to start with something round. So I placed it as close to center as I can. Now I want to pat my clay down and get it seated to the wheel head. Now I've got it seated down, and now I want to seal it. So I'll take some water, and with a finger I'll go right along that edge, and I'll get it sealed down. If I didn't do all this ahead of time, if I just started with just that ball of clay, water would get sucked underneath the edges of the clay, and it would get between the bat or the wheel head and the ball of clay, and it would start to get slippery, and then it would just dislodge and it would come right off the wheel. So you really have to get your clay seated down and stuck down. So now I'm ready to get started. What I want to do, it's called centering. If my clay is not centered on the wheel, I'll never be able to get a good pot thrown from the clay that I'm working with. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing in with my left hand and down with my right hand. And you can see as I push in with my left, the clay starts to work its way inward and upward. If I come down with my right hand, it'll push it back down and it'll make it short and wide. What I'm doing when I'm centering is I'm putting even pressure in and down. And we'll push it right back into center. What I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to knock it off center and recenter it. And you can see if I have a mound of clay on the wheel that was bobbling around like this, I'm never going to be able to work with it. So we have to do the centering. So I get my clay wet. And the reason I get the clay wet is the water acts as a lubricant. It lets your hands slide on the clay. If I just work with dry hands on dry clay, my hands would get stuck to it and everything would just get pulled right off the wheel. I wouldn't be able to actually form a pot on the wheel. So I use water. And all I do is I soak it up in the sponge and I'll drip some down and I'll get my hands wet. You don't have to use a lot of water. You just want to use enough water to allow your hands to slide. If you're putting tons of water on and just continually soaking it, number one, you just make a big mess inside your splash pan. Number two, clay is porous and it acts like a sponge. If we keep putting water on the clay, it just keeps sucking more and more water in, and then it gets so soft and gooey that it can't actually hold a wall up when you try to pull the wall for your side of your pot. So you want to use just enough water for your hands to slide. You can see I pushed in with my left, down with my right, and I was able to push that uneven mass of clay right back into center. And I'll do it again. Got a very wobbly ball of clay. Now I just push in with my left, down with my right. And you may have noticed I keep my sponge in my hand at all times. What I'm doing is when I'm centering, I'm squeezing my sponge just a little bit and it's letting water down onto the clay. Because while I'm centering and I'm pushing on here, my hand is scraping away all that water and wet clay off the top surface. So if I'm able to keep it just wet enough for my hands to slide, it allows the clay to easily work through my hands and go right into center. One of the things that I want to talk about is the direction that the wheel is turning. I've got it turning counterclockwise. That's because I'm right-handed, and I don't know if this makes any difference, but it's the way I was taught how to throw. Because you're pushing in with your left hand, and that's the force that you're using to center, and you're leaning over to your left, it has to turn into the pressure that you're pushing back. If it was turning clockwise, it would be turning away from the pressure, and you would end up just pushing around the clay, not into it. So with it turning counterclockwise, it pushes into the force of your left hand. And any of that big, bumpy, wobbly, inconsistency in the clay gets pushed inward. So you can see, as I push in with my left hand, if I drew a line from my elbow through my wrist right across the center of the clay and out into the corner of the splash pan, that's where I'm pushing. And you can see as I push, it puts it all right back into center. Now I just have to push back down to even out the mass. Now when you're beginning, a lot of students will ask, how hard do I actually need to push on the clay? Well, that's a question that really has no answer. I always say you have to push just hard enough. There is no pounds per square inch answer I can give you. I'll say push as hard as you think you need to, and then some. If you feel like you're going to push it off the wheel head, that's how hard you need to push. And for the most part, a student, they don't push hard enough. They're not sure how hard they need to push. So they've got this clay that's bobbling around in their hand, and they just let their hands kind of go for a ride on it. They never really get any pressure against it, and they never get it centered. So if you think of taking your hands, and if you were going to push a refrigerator against the wall, really get in there, make noise if you need to, grunt on it. Just get in there and you'll get it centered. So you've got to put some pressure on it.